Alright, so we're going to be talking about God is one and laws of exclusivity. I'm trying to mix kind of two concepts there, that there's one God, and since there is one God, then he deserves kind of exclusive rights in a sense, and that we should worship him in a unique way. And if you haven't been here for a few weeks, which is most of us here actually, we've been going through a series of the law and how we don't necessarily just throw them all out, and we're kind of trying to approach it in a way that you get the spirit of the law and the principle of the law and be able to apply it. A lot of people just say, oh, we don't need the law or whatnot, but no, it does seem like with other verses that we've looked at, this is all scripture is beneficial for, reproof, for doctrine, for all these different things, and so we can't just throw them all away, even though no one likes to look at the books of Deuteronomy or Leviticus. They are actually kind of interesting, at least to me, but they're still useful. They're still in the Bible for our benefit, and so we're looking at that, and we're kind of going through the Ten Commandments, and we've just started in a sense. We first laid down some foundation the past few weeks of why the law is still important for us today, and how they are incorporated into the Ten Commandments, and that's where we're going to start to see that you can find most laws, you pick a law, and then you can kind of think about it for a while and see how it applies to one of these Ten Commandments. And actually a lot of them will overlap. A couple of the ones that I'll kind of mention today, you could kind of throw into the second of the Ten Commandments, also maybe even the third, depending on how you explain it. But that's what we're kind of going through, is we're looking at the Ten Commandments, and then we're going to bring other laws that aren't looked at, and how do they make sense to us today. So that's what we're going to go through. And if it's been a while since you guys actually looked at the Ten Commandments, the first one is, thou shalt have no other gods before me, thou shalt make any graven images, you shall not, and then you shall not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Honor thy father and thy mother. Thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor, and thou shalt not covet. So there's a lot of laws there, but not even close to the actual, all the laws in the other books, which total to about 613. Now, you might be scared that I'm mentioning that in a sense, like, oh, we're going to go over all those laws? No, I don't have time for that. I could barely enough work on this lesson to try and come up with this, and we're only looking at a few laws and trying to explain it. So that's why we're trying to go over a few laws, how you interpret it, how to understand it in a sense, and apply it so that you can kind of understand that concept for yourself, so when you read the law on your own time, you'll be able to interpret it. So obviously the Ten Commandments come from Exodus 20, that's where they're given. This is the first one, I am the Lord thy God, which has brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And so God's really, making it known there are no powers outside of himself, no gods outside of other than himself, and he is the only God to be worshipped by the Israelites and obviously everyone else, but there is no other God. And so when I was thinking about that and kind of meditating on that, I was listening to some sermons, and they kind of brought up some interesting things that the world kind of brings up, is like, oh, we're all worshiping the same God, just in different ways, in different religions, and it's just like, no, all religions do not worship the same God, and they're vastly different. And I've had some conversations, it's like, well, aren't all religions basically the same? And it's like, no. They are very different. Sure, they might line up on a few things, like don't murder, but even with that one, different religions will take that to different levels. As I remember in my religious studies class, my professor told me that if you're really up there with the Buddhist philosophy, that they have no killing whatsoever. So even the killing of a insect would be wrong, and so they take it to the extreme. So even in that sense, they're vastly different, and even the concepts of different religions, of their view of God. And so I was just going to bring up a few just to kind of show how different they are. Now, Buddhism is a kind of very interesting one, too, because they don't really quite believe in a God. They kind of believe in this kind of existence kind of thing. And it's kind of mistaken that Buddha is a god, but actually Buddha is more of a perfect person, or a person who's become enlightened. Now you do kind of show, I don't know, homage, that might be the right word, but or other things that you're kind of showing respect, because you kind of are supposed to learn from the Buddha because they've reached that enlightenment, and you're kind of showing respect and that you learn from them. And so everyone, as supposing the Buddhism kind of has that potential to become a perfect person also in that way. And so there's that. That's quite different than what we believe. And Hinduism is another one. And actually, this is actually from Wikipedia. This line is a diverse system of thought with beliefs spanning monotheism, polytheism, pantheism, and atheism. Hinduism is almost anything you want it to be, almost, in one sense. You can pick a god and say, this is my god, because that's the thing, is Hinduism does have a diverse set of gods, or maybe you just say, no, I don't believe in gods. So it's really crazy exactly what they believe, because it's very diverse. Another one is Jainism, polytheism, and pantheism, which is the belief that there are many gods, and then also pantheism, that God is in everything. And so in another sense, I was watching a video of it this week, and they're saying also, like, you are God because you're part of the universe, and it's like you become God, and it's like, okay, that's an interesting one. And Rastafarianism, you might not have heard this one before, but actually a kind of well-known person of him, or one who follows that belief, is Bob Marley, who was kind of person who made reggae popular. But they are kind of monotheistic in view, single God, and they refer to him as Jah, and particularly resides within the individual. And in a sense, this one kind of basically took certain elements of Christianity and then just incorporated it into the culture and society of Jamaica and other Afrocentric societies, in a sense. And when I was reading on this one, it literally just said in parentheses, Black Jesus. And they were like, really like, Jesus is black. That, I'm like, okay, he was a Jew. I don't think that's true, but okay. So they were really like staunch on that. So there's a lot of views on God, and they are quite diverse and different. And so how could you believe that there are tons of gods, and then at the same time no God, or just one God, and somehow that actually we're still worshiping the same God? So that, it just doesn't add up. So I kind of just bringing that up to just kind of squash that philosophy, even though hopefully all of us already understand that. So we'll now begin to look at some of the laws, and they will be probably ones you've never even read or heard. But in Deuteronomy 12, it says, when you drive out the nations that live there, you must destroy all the places where they worship their gods. High on the mountaintops, on the hills, and under every green tree, break down their altars and smash their sacred pillars, burn their Asherah poles, and cut down their carved idols completely. Erase the names of their gods. Do not worship the Lord your God in the ways these pagan people worship their gods. So what's happening in the backdrop of, like, in history-wise, is the Israelites, they're going into the promised land, and God says destroy the pagan worship practices, in a sense, the temples and all the stuff that is in the land, because you are not to worship God in the same way. You don't want that temptation. And then again, it kind of repeats itself at the end of the chapter. It says, do not fall into the trap of following their customs and worship their gods. Do not inquire about their gods, saying, how do these nations worship their gods? I want to follow their example. You must not worship the Lord your God the way other nations worship their gods. So the principle within those two laws, or in a sense same chapter though, is don't mix religions. And that's kind of partly why I brought up the other religions. I know sometimes it's interesting to learn about other religions, but God is saying directly, don't go look into other churches or synagogues or other places. Don't go to a Buddhist temple and say, oh, how do you worship your God? I'm going to start incorporating that philosophy into how I worship God, or going to different places. God is very strict on that, saying, you're not to mix. You don't want to fall prey to that. God has already outlined enough rules for us to follow that it's hard enough to, in a sense, to apply the ones He's told us to, and to work on those, in a sense. And so we also kind of were discussing in previous weeks how you kind of find the principle, you find the love aspect, and in a sense the love aspect of why you want to not worship in that way is that you don't want to fall into temptation of other religions, in a sense. You don't want convert to another religion, or you don't want to be a bad example to others. Actually, the early church struggles with the mixing of religions, you could say, and they try to incorporate pagan styles of worship. And even modern church kind of struggles with it a little bit, depending on what you all classify as it. But as the early church, there's a lot of Romans that became Christians. And the Romans, they worshipped gods in temples and with statues and great pictures and all these interesting things that you see in certain art classes that you might take at school or all that stuff. And so the people wanted to bring that along to the Christian church. And there was a big debate. Is like, should we worship God with statues of him or pictures of saints and all that? And that debate was kind of known as the iconoclasm debate. And it did eventually split the church. That's partly where the Catholic Church and the Protestant kind of broke ways, is over the decision over do we worship God with images. Because if we try and make a statue of God, it will always be wrong because we don't know what God exactly looks like. So that's just one example of how the early church struggled with it. And I was just thinking, so that's the principle you want to draw, is just don't allow pagan practices into your life or mixing of them into your worship or whatnot. And I was just trying to kind of come up with some examples to think about that are religious that we might not even always think about. And I put pagan meditation. That is the way of emptying one out that is more associated with Buddhists and a little bit of Hinduism, that you're trying to kind of reach this state of nirvana and kind of like nothingness, and that's why it's always like emptying yourself out in peace and silence and whatnot. And sure, it might be nice to sit in peace and quiet, but God doesn't actually want you to meditate in that way. The Hebrew word for meditation kind of more translates to chewing. And so you want to read a passage in Scripture and think about it and meditate on it to learn from it. You're not trying to just go mindless. You're supposed to actually become mindful of the verse and understand it. So that's the proper way of meditation. And this also kind of brings up the question of kind of yoga. I know sometimes certain preachers have brought that up as whether Christians should do it, and there's a slight debate. And really, if you look into it, as I was kind of looking into it, yoga is actually very deep into the religious practices, that each pose means certain different things and is supposed to do certain stuff. And it's real crazy. I'm like, wow, I knew it was somewhat religious, but I didn't know it was that like deep in there. But it's just like, okay, do you really have to do yoga, especially in like a lot of classes that you might take that do it? They'll start like bringing in certain religious aspects. They'll start talking about it, and it's like, you can just find another way to stretch. Another one is karma. That's also in the Hinduism, I think more of them, that you do a good action and a good action will come your way. And I always feel like sad is when Christians start talking about good karma and karma coming their way. I'm like, it's not a Christian philosophy. Why do you believe that? That one's just kind of interesting. Now another one is weed or drugs. You might not necessarily think that that is very a religious aspect, but back in kind of the Old Testament times, weed and drugs were very kind of synonymous with witchcraft, and because that's how they would create concoctions of like potions and stuff, and you give it to them, and you're just actually high. You're just on a trip, and you think you're having a religious experience with God, but you're just drugged. So there's a lot of aspects with that, and actually I also brought up the Rastafarianism belief, because that was actually a very key component of their worship services. In a sense, you would get high, and that would be part of it. You'd even eat weed, brownies in a sense, whatever food, you could even eat it straight, as I was reading, that's what they would do. And that's why Bob Marley, he's kind of synonymous also with marijuana. So that's another aspect, that you're not to worship God in that way that you're supposed to go to church high. No, you're supposed to come, sober-minded, as verses in the New Testament say. Another one that also is not normally thought about too much is tattoos, or henna tattoos especially. That one is temporary, but it is kind of associated with the Hinduism also, that they would draw certain designs and stuff, and they would mean certain things, and then certain African religions that I went over were kind of describing tattoos that people put on their bodies that represent certain things, and especially, you see a lot of people get the yin-yang sign. Very religious in nature, but not as much as we think of it in our society. And it is a little bit different in different societies, what they all mean, but at the same time, they are from other religious, in a sense, practices. And I always feel sad too is when a Christian's like, oh, I'm going to get a Christian tattoo. And it's like, well, you just saying Christian doesn't really make it Christian. Even if you make it a cross, you make it a verse, you're still worshiping God in the same way that pagan culture, pagan religions were worshiping their God. And so we come through that is you're not supposed to worship God in that way. And so that's one reason why, I have always been kind of against tattoos. That, and there's also just verses that say don't get a tattoo, which people argue with at the same time, though. Another one is just like dream catchers. I go to people's houses, and I always just feel awkward when I see those. I'm like, well, why do you, I know they look interesting, but why would you have one, And lastly is astrology, zodiac signs, and I always occasionally get people like, oh, what's your sign? I don't believe in it. And it's just simply, that's my sign. So there's no powers outside of God, and I think it is a little bit of a bad representation as a Christian to kind of mix with, other religions or pagan society in one sense for that it's like, are you Christian? And you're also going to start talking about karma, astrology. You're acknowledging there's other powers outside of God. It's a bad example. So that's not an exhaustive list. Those are just some that came to mind when I was doing a little bit of research on it. And so you could probably find a lot of ways. So another verse, I cannot read that on my screen. I'm going to read it up here. Real long. Deuteronomy, another one in Deuteronomy. If you hear someone in your cities, which the Lord your God gives you to dwell in, saying, corrupt men have gone out from among you, and entice the inhabitants of the city, saying, let us go and serve other gods which you have not known, then you shall inquire, search out, and ask diligently. And if it is indeed true and certain that such abominations was committed among you, you shall surely strike the inhabitants of the city an edge of the sword, utterly destroying it all that is in the livestock with the edge of the sword, and you shall gather all of its plunder into the middle of the streets and completely burn with fire the city, its plunder, for the Lord your God. It shall be a heap for it, shall not be built again, so none of the accursed things shall remain in your hand, that the Lord may turn from fierceness of his anger and show you mercy, have compassion on you, multiply you, just as he swore to your fathers, because you have listened to the voice of your Lord your God, to keep his commandments, which I command you today. So a lot of words there. But the main things you want to kind of see here is the destroying of kind of the pagan stuff. They're being tempted. It says that none of the accursed things shall remain in your hand. You don't want to be tempted in that way. And we do see this actually take place in the New Testament. In Acts, it says, and many who had believed came confessing and telling their deeds. Also many of these who had practiced magic brought their books together and burned them in the sight of all. And they counted up the value of them, and it totaled 50,000 pieces of silver. So the word of the Lord grew mighty and prevailed. So we do see that in the New Testament church that people converted. They were, saying witchcraft in a sense, or magic. They had their magic books of spells, and they decided, okay, I'm now Christian, I'm going to burn it. And it's not something that they're just like, oh, I'm just going to hold on to this, I'll put this on my bookshelf to show people when they come by, or maybe I'll look at it occasionally, practice a couple chants or whatnot. It's like, no. They burned it because they did not want to stumble into the same sins they were living. They don't want to let other people's get it and fall into the same trap. And the interesting thing is they do say 50,000 pieces of silver. Why did they mention how much money that the stuff cost? Is because that's how much they did not want anyone else to get it. They didn't want to profit off it. Because someone would be like, well, okay, I might be transferring from Buddhism to, Christianity. I have a Buddha, I'm gonna sell it and make a little money profit. No, you don't want to let someone even get that. You want to just destroy it. And this is kind of the same philosophy that when people come over to the house that are like Jehovah's Witness, they walk by, you know, they go door to door, like, oh, would you like a pamphlet? Sure, I'll take one. It's gone. You know, I take it just so that I know that maybe one less person will have access to it and read it and fall prey to it. So in that sense, and that's where they could have made money, but no, they did not want people to suffer in the same way. So what is the principle there? Destroy the access you have to your previous or current, if you're living in sin, obviously, sinful lifestyles. So just another example of an Old Testament law being used in the New Testament and today. So another one, moving on to another Deuteronomy. I think they're all in Deuteronomy, just about, except for one. If there arises among you a prophet or dreamer of dreams, and he gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder comes to pass of which he spoke to you, saying, let us go after other gods, which you have not known, and let us serve them. You shall not listen to the words of that prophet or the dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and you shall walk after the Lord your God and fear him and keep his commandments and obey his voice. You shall serve him and hold fast to him. So this is where someone is having a dream and he says, oh, my dream told me we're going to convert to some other religion, in a sense. And you're supposed to hear that and say, no, in a sense. It's just, okay, why would I change religions? You know, it's very clear. And God's saying right there, it's just a test. You're not to listen to him. Seeing this similar sense in the New Testament, it says, whoever transgresses and does not abide in the doctrines of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine of Christ has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him into your house, nor greet him. For he who greets him shares in his evil deeds. Now this is very controversial in a sense, that Christians used to be a little bit more, I guess you could say, reclusive, or a little bit more tight-knit group that, in a sense, they would kind of just stay among other Christians, where society today is more, you just go about your life as usual. Now, this kind of brings up the question in today's sermon, and is kind of like, well, do you have non-Christian friends or not? And I think there's the verse that was used in today's sermon is slightly a bit, how would I say, kind of misused sometimes, to say, oh, you need to become whatever the person you're talking to is to best meet the person. And it's a lot of times used for friendship salvation, in a sense, as I would say, you first got to become their friend before you can save them. But the problem with that philosophy is you're going to be caught up in being friends before you ever get to a conversation about the Bible, and then also we don't see that in the New Testament, really. We see Paul going from city to city, just talking and just going straight to the gospel. They say, oh, do you believe in God? No. Okay, well, tell me why. I'll explain to you why I believe in God. You don't see God saying, or not God, Paul going around like, oh, let's go out for some coffee first and see how your life is and talk about that. First become friends. I kind of equate friendship salvation to dating salvation, in a sense of, okay, well, I'm going to date the person, and along the way of dating the person who's not saved, I'll eventually convert them. It almost never works. I've actually never seen it done. I've seen a lot of sad relationships break up over that, in a sense. It always ends poorly. And if not, that they do get married, it really becomes incredibly difficult for the children, because I've seen that side too, that it's like, well, what do you do with the kids? Do they go to church or do they not? And it becomes a constant fight within the house that both parents are trying to convince their kids of two different philosophies, that there is a God or there isn't, and it becomes a family war, in a sense. And so I would say the Bible is more teaching of we obviously are to be friendly and whatnot with people, but not necessarily we have to first become friends. Let's get the gospel out, of course. That should be our key focus. Now, another one that kind of says the same thing is, now I urge you, brethren, Note those who cause division and offense contrary to the doctrine which you learned, and avoid them, for those who are such do not serve our Lord Jesus Christ, but their own belly, and by smooth words and flattering speech deceive the hearts of the simple. And so you also might be, a lot of times that when we come across verses like this, you're like, well, what about Jesus? He hung out with the sinners, right? And he, we're doing, hanging out and having a good old time, right? But the thing is, every time that he hung out with them, they were converted, in a sense. Not all of them, but that was his goal. He would present the gospel. He'd say, I'm God in a sense, in a roundabout way. And that was what was happening. And so that's how we should approach it, in a sense, that we should be trying to present the gospel first and foremost to people. And not necessarily trying to first become, because you can be brought down with that. And so do not listen or entertain false gods or heresies. There is a lot. That's where it said doctrine and whatnot in some of those examples. So another law. But if there is a defect in it, if it is lame or blind or has any serious defect, you shall not sacrifice it to the Lord your God. And so with this one, you're like, okay, well, what's the point of this? This is one of those sacrificial laws that are ended with Jesus Christ, since he's the last sacrifice, right? How do we apply that concept? That doesn't make any sense. Here's another example, though, of that law, in a sense. Going from, this one was kind of more so for a lamb or an animal that you're sacrificing. This is also bringing up the human aspect, not that you sacrifice humans, but it says, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron, saying, no man of your descendants in succeeding generations who has any defect may approach to offer the bread of his God. For any man who has a defect shall not approach a man blind, a man lame, whose marred face, any limb too long, a man who has broken foot or broken hand, or is a hunchback or dwarf, or a man who has defect in his eye, eczema, or scab, or is in a eunuch. No man of the descendants of Aaron the priest, who has a defect, shall come near to offer the offerings made by fire to the Lord. And it has a defect, he shall not come near to offer the bread of his God. He may eat the bread of his God, both the most holy and holy, only he shall not go near the veil or approach the altar, because he has a defect, lest he profane my sanctuary, for I, the Lord, sanctifies them. Another long one. But so the thing here is, he's saying this for the priests. So the first is with kind of your sacrifice that you're giving to God. You want to give God your best. That's kind of the principle there. And this one is your teachers, in a sense, your priests, that approaches God in that sense, should also be perfect, not deformed in any way. So how do you apply those concepts to the New Testament, in a sense, to us? How do we get the spirit of the law instead of just applying it directly? Because we don't really do any sacrifices anymore. We don't do that. That's true. And we don't technically have priests. We have pastors and whatnot. And so that's kind of where you go. More on that side is with the Romans. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. So one, we are to present ourselves as a sacrifice, a living one, in a sense, and be as perfect as we can in that sense. Be good and godly. And then also on that, so that was kind of more towards the first verse, and the second verse is in Timothy. This is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. It's good to become, in a sense, a teacher. A bishop then must be blameless and husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride he falls into the same condemnation as the devil. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he falls into reproach and the snare of the devil. So with that, we're taking the spiritual aspect of the law and applying it. He's saying we need to have a standard. We got to have a godly standard, a godly man in front of us who are teaching. And so these are the things that they should and shouldn't be doing in a sense. And so there's the qualifications for leadership. And that's where certain pastors do get promoted too soon and that are suffering in certain sins. And that's where then the outside church, or not outside church, outside people who are not going to church or religious, they'll say, oh, look at that pastor. He's a hypocrite. He's greedy. He's not hospitable. He has many wives, Who knows? It could be like that they'll point their fingers and say, oh, hypocrite, and then it tarnishes the name of Christ in a sense in the church. And there's actually, this is a difficult one. I remember discussing with someone that there are churches that actually struggled with that one of multiple wives, that in the culture that they were a part of, it was normal for them to have multiple wives. And so when they became Christian, they're like, you cannot teach. You can't be a pastor in that sense. And so there were difficulty dealing with those. And so the principle, obviously, is do not promote those with spiritual defects, you could say. In the Old Testament, it's very physical, as, too long of an arm or diseases or whatnot. But this, spiritual, we are to be spiritually mature to be able to teach. And so finally, just kind of wrapping up, so we went over thou shalt have no other gods before me. That's the whole kind of one. And those verses kind of attribute, you could label into the first one. And so Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. It's in Matthew. And so because we have an exclusive relationship with God, it should affect how we worship. It should affect how we think. And it should affect how we present ourselves to God and interact with people. And so that's how we should worship God, is in a unique way that how he has told us to worship him.